Good evening. My name is Paul Friedman, and I'm the Executive Director of SaferCountry. Welcome to the Red Flag Forum to talk about the creation and implementation of the new Virginia law establishing an extreme risk protection order. It also has other names. We'll get into that. My guess is that everyone on this Zoom knows what this is in general, but tonight you'll get a deeper dive from our panelists. In particular, I hope we'll learn a bit about how this order will be publicized, how the order will be tracked, and if there are any special considerations for implementing this order in minority communities. As we know, trust is currently at a low point. Now, please note we're taping this for future use, and we will attempt to answer as many questions, please send them through chat as possible based upon our time. I first want to start by thanking our sponsors. Our leadership circle is Ronald Abramson. Champions are Mike Gelb and the Simpson Development Company. The advocates are Anonymous, Renal Butler, and the law firm Wade Grimes, Friedman, Mencken, and Leishner, as well as hosts Ken Cummins, Alan Lomax, Laura Mandela of Mandela Research, and Boyd Walker. Of our donors, Mike Gelb, Donnie Simpson from Simpson Development, and Ken Cummins are on our advisory committee. Further, Boyd Walker is our president, and Laura Mandela is our vice president. Laura will be leading our audience Q&A at the end of our program tonight, so stay tuned for that. I want to first give a shout out to a couple of people in our audience. I hope they've joined by now. Shannon Taylor, the Commonwealth's attorney in Henrico County, who worked on this bill with activist and gun violence prevention champion Lori Haas, and Sarah Peck. Sarah recently led a project at Northeastern University School of Law that created an invaluable report called Extreme Risk Protection Orders, Implementation in a Social Context. I urge everyone interested in this subject to read it, and a link to it may be found on our Facebook page. In 2019, I founded SaferCountry and became its executive director. Our mission is to keep guns out of unsafe hands. You can find more details on me and the group online at www.safercountry.org and our Facebook page. Essentially, we're trying to ensure that the laws in place are effectively implemented to prevent people barred from having a gun from getting one. We're also in favor of policies and laws that will expand upon what we already have, such as closing background check loopholes and laws like the one we'll be discussing tonight. Now, good messaging is essential in any public-facing campaign. This law requires the public to initiate action. The term red flag is controversial. This forum used the phrase because it's been used in the media quite a bit. So people do connect with it. Yet I have to say the mental health community is sensitive to it. As it's concerned, it may be negatively interpreted. At the same time, the term ERPO, E-R-P-O, for Extreme Risk Protection Order, is foreign to a lot of people outside the universe where it's used. Generally unappealing, I think, and not entirely accurate. So in a brainstorming session on this matter earlier today with someone who works on this issue in Chicago, he works very intensely on this. We discussed this, and I came up with an alternative. We liked it a lot. I'm going to share it with you, get your reaction. I hope you'll be kind and honest in the chat room if you like this idea, but marketing is a key factor in making this success, we believe. So the idea is TIGER, T-I-D-E-R, temporarily implemented gun emergency removal. That's TIGER, temporarily implemented gun emergency removal. We think it's more accurate, more memorable, and certainly inoffensive, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Finally, because I'm a lifelong fan of the Beatles, together and individually, I want to set our stage by noting that 40 years ago, in December, John Lennon was shot to death by Mark David Chapman. That shooting was shocking and even more devastating, given John Lennon's work for peace. But what makes it relevant to our conversation is that Chapman's wife, Gloria, knew what he was planning. Had this law existed at the time and been used, John would almost certainly not have been killed that night and might still be with us today. So remarkably, And I might add, remarkably, even the killer later wished his wife had gone to the police. Imagine that. Now, joining us tonight, we have some very special speakers. Representative Don Beyer, who's working on national legislation related to this subject. Delegate Rip Sullivan. Don Beyer, of course, is from the 8th District here in Virginia. Delegate Rip Sullivan is with us tonight, and he's from the 48th House District. Rip was involved in introducing this bill in the House and has a font of knowledge for us on this. We also have Alexandria Commonwealth Attorney Brian Porter. Brian serves on our advisory committee, I'm proud to say. We also have expert on protection orders, Attorney Rebecca Wade from the Wade Grimes Friedman firm, and Army Colonel retired Mike Jason, a defense consultant with the Pentagon, who's also on our advisory committee. Each speaker is going to get about 10 minutes or so. I may ask a question at the end of that period, and then we'll turn the ball over to Laura, so she has an opportunity to present the questions from the chat room. And of course, at any point when Congressman Beyer joins us, after that speaker is finished, we'd like to insert him to give him the opportunity to make his presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, and lacking Don on the camera, I'm going to turn to Rip and ask him to give us an overview of how this bill was passed, his expectations for implementation, and any of his other thoughts at this point. Thank you, Rip. Are you there?
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to see you virtually. Paul, I wasn't sure, is Chief Brown on as well?
Now there was a technical problem. I don't know if he's made it on yet, but I know he was working on it.
I can see him.
Yeah. Okay. He's going to try to join by phone, he's noted. So I'm going to see if he's trying to reach us. In the meantime, why don't you go ahead, Rip.
Good evening, everybody. It is really nice to see you all. And thank you, Paul, for convening this this session. This bill has had it's been a long road to get this bill passed, and candidly, it's a little hard to believe, and it's very exciting that it's gonna go into effect. What, a week from yesterday. I first heard about in those days. The acronym that I heard most often was GVRO, Gun Violence Restraining Orders. I want to say at least 4, maybe even 5 years ago. Heard about it generally, and then I spent a lot of time talking with Lori Haas about it. And before I forget, let me also thank Shannon Taylor for all the help over the years, helping to perfect this bill. Shannon was part of a broad group of people, both formal and informal stakeholders, I should call them, from law enforcement, gun safety advocates, of course. A lot of people came together, and the bill changed as a result over the years, and frankly, it just got better and better. So Shannon, thank you for your role in that. I really appreciate it. So I first heard about this concept 4 or 5 years ago, and there were a lot of things about it that I found really interesting. From a legislative perspective, the first thing I found interesting about it, and particularly as a legislator who at the time was mired sort of deep in the minority, was that the bill had generated, at least in other places in the country, bipartisan support. It had passed in what you might think of as red states. It had prominent Republicans who would support it, and so here I was in the minority at the time, trying hard, recognizing that I would need to try hard to generate support on the other side of the aisle, or the bill was not going to go anywhere. And I continued to work hard at that. I'm disappointed to report that in the end, at least here in Virginia, it did not generate any Republican support, at least any Republican members of the General Assembly. I think, candidly, I think there are some members on the other side of the aisle who wanted to vote for it, who would have voted for it perhaps under other circumstances. But in the end, this became a highly partisan, or remained a highly partisan bill. I spent a lot of my time talking as I was, particularly this session, as we were moving towards passage. It was a rare time when you heard Rip Sullivan, liberal Democrat, talking about Donald Trump and his support for the bill that I was proposing. Donald Trump, in his confirmation hearings, Attorney General Bill Barr described ERPOs as the most important thing we can do in the gun safety space. I mean, it's a long list of Republican senators, governors who not only spoken in support of it, but signed and voted for bills like this. But 5 years ago, I was swimming upstream, but kept at it. I've introduced the bill, I think it's either 4 or 5 years in a row. And as I suggested earlier, in my view, it got better and better with some changes we made. None of the changes, in my view, harmed the bill in terms of what we were trying to do with it. The bill probably got its biggest jolt of energy right after Parkland. You'll recall that after, by the way, the bill had gone down to defeat that session. All the gun bills had gone down to defeat that session when Parkland happened. The governor got involved. There was some talk about whether we were going to try to bring the bill back in the wake of Parkland. But the reason the Parkland tragedy shines such a bright light on this is that shortly after Parkland, of course, Governor, now Senator, but then Governor Rick Scott, became a supporter of these bills, and the bill actually passed in Florida. And one of the reasons that Parkland was such a tipping point is obviously so many things tragic about the Parkland tragedy. But if you recall, that was one of those, not unlike Paul's story about Mark David Chapman. The sheriff in that case got in front of the cameras and said, we knew about this guy. We knew a lot of people were worried about him. We knew he had a lot of weapons, but there was nothing that we could do. He hadn't broken any laws. There was no legal way, nothing sanctioned under the law for us to take guns away from him. And that resonated with an awful lot of people. And really, as I said, started to generate a lot of momentum for this bill. The other thing that I think has helped us generate momentum for this bill, quite aside from the Parklands of the world and the other mass shooting tragedies that we've grown unfortunately accustomed to, is that if you look at the statistics and the science behind these bills, and one of the nice things about this bill is that there actually is some science behind it, is that it is as much, if not more, a suicide prevention bill as it is a mass shooting prevention bill. In the States, I'm thinking particularly of Connecticut and Indiana, where this bill's been around for a few years. There have actually been some studies done, peer-reviewed studies, which show suicide rates dropping as a result of this legislation. And we all know the statistics, at least those of us on the line here, who spend a lot of time in the gun safety space. When we're talking about gun deaths, gun violence in Virginia and nationally, well north of 50% of those deaths are suicide by gun. And so if you're talking not just about trying to head off the next Parkland, but you're talking about actually trying to reduce gun death by gun, you have to deal with the crisis of suicide rates in Virginia and nationally. Of course, in Virginia, one of the things that resonates particularly is the sort of crushingly sad suicide rate among our veteran population. So that was one of the reasons that I sort of always hoped that this bill could break out of the pack, if you will, from the other the sort of package of gun safety bills, the one gun a month, the assault weapons bans, which are so highly politicized. This had a little different flavor to it, at least to my way of thinking. And as I said, I was able to get some nodding heads from the other side of the aisle, and occasionally, believe it or not, in my conversations with folks in the NRA or the VCDL. Because I would start moving backwards. You sort of start with, everyone agrees, apropos of the name of your organization, Paul, right? No one wants guns in the wrong hands, whether you're talking about bad people or whether you're talking about people in some sort of crisis, mental health crisis. And the VCDL would agree with that. Always does agree with it. It's when you start to talk about implementing it that we would sort of part ways. But in any event, the long story, which I've made too long, is that this bill took, I think, 4 or 5 years to pass. This year it passed. It was HB 674 in the House. Senator Barker had SB 240 in the Senate. Bill could have died a couple different times. It actually was a tie vote in the Senate when my bill went across the aisle, when it went down the hall. Lionel's never.
He needs to unmute himself.
Yeah, I'm on. I have now twice unmuted myself and it keeps muting. So I don't know when I muted, but I was talking about the passage of the bill. It was it actually required the lieutenant governor to break a tie in the Senate, but the bill finally did pass, and we're very excited about it. You were talking about its name, Paul. The name of the forum this evening, ERPO. This bill actually is affirmatively, if you read it, it is not even an ERPO. ERPO stands for Extreme Risk Protective Order, and that's what some states do call it if you read the statute. This bill, this statute creates a substantial risk protection order, or an emergency substantial risk protective order in the first instance. But ERPO is what it's come to be known. As you suggested, Paul, in your introductory remarks, a lot of people know them. Media talks about them as red flag laws. None of us particularly like that name. It has some connotations that are unfortunate, and you're right, the mental health community particularly doesn't. And so I always make a point when I'm talking about the bill of emphasizing what we all know to be true, that people with mental health issues, challenges, are not dangerous. The fact that someone is struggling with a mental health issue does not make them dangerous. So to the extent this bill suggests otherwise, I, like you, Paul, wish we could use some different names. But in any event, it's going to be law in less than a week now. I'll be interested in Brian and Chief Brown's comments about its pending implementation. We, as I said, consulted at great length with law enforcement, trying to smooth out questions and try to make it workable in the real world. I'm very excited about its implementation. Candidly, I don't think anyone really knows whether we're going to see a lot of these or a little few of these, but I think it is going to be very important to monitor it, see how many there are, get a feel for how the messaging on it is going, whether the word is out that it's usable. I will tell you, I don't want to jinx myself, but at the moment, no one, to my knowledge at least, no one's filed any lawsuits relating to it. There are a couple lawsuits out there relating to some of the other gun safety measures we passed this year. This bill has held up under constitutional scrutiny in other states when it's been challenged. We, of course, as you might expect, received a lot of Second Amendment pushback, a lot of sort of bumper sticker complaints that this was a way to take people's guns from them, law-abiding people's guns from them. But we thought, and I'll end with this, that what this bill does is strike a reasonable real-world balance between someone's Second Amendment rights and public and personal safety, and gives family and friends an opportunity to maybe avoid the next Parkland, or maybe avoid. I loved the reference to imagine, Paul. Imagine that. You know, I remember where I was when John Lennon was killed. It was
Sadly, I do too.
it was awful. So anyway, I've probably gone more than my allotted 10 minutes. Typical politician. I'll cede the floor now to whoever's next. Happy to take your questions, and if you're interested, sort of relive the blow by blow of this. But to my way of thinking, it was a great success. Sort of finally climbing that mountain. And I should say, as my final word here, looking out at some really familiar faces. Hi, Andy. Team effort from an awful lot of people, and I want to thank all of you on this call who were part of that, because there are a lot of fingerprints on this bill's success, and a lot of those fingerprints are yours. So I'm grateful for your help.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and offering those thoughts, and we look forward to sticking around to answer some questions if there are any, and if any of your own if they come up. So at this point, we want to turn the ball over to Brian Porter, Alexandria's Commonwealth's attorney. We're thrilled to have Brian on. He's got, I think, some insight as well from, I hope, from the Attorney General's office about implementation and other thoughts about this. So I'm looking forward to that. I just add that we are going to be the 18th state in the union. The District of Columbia has this law as well, but we'll be the 18th state to have this law when it is enacted, when it's effective on July 1st. And we're still on the cutting edge of this, so there's a lot for us to learn and a lot for us to experiment with here. All right, Brian, the ball is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. First of all, for putting this together. It's a really important topic to discuss, and I think it's really important for the community to hear from those of us that are going to be involved in the implementation. I also want to thank Delegate Sullivan. I mean, I remember being in a meeting with him in Arlington with him and Lori Haas 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember all of us realizing that there was not a great chance that the bill was going to go anywhere with the way the assembly was assembled at that point, as far as the breakdown politically. So I think it's a great example of perseverance and a lot of joint effort. A lot of people were really motivated about this, and I just really thank Rip for his leadership on such an important topic. I became first interested in this many years ago. I think it was probably the year I was first elected as a Commonwealth attorney. And this is a real world problem. Several times a year, I was the violent crimes prosecutor at the time, and I would receive phone calls from law enforcement officers who had taken someone into custody for mental health observation, and at the same time discovered a cache of weapons in an apartment. And the one that particularly struck me was a person was having some suicidal ideation and was taken in for mental health observation. And I remember the police officers calling me from the scene and saying, look, there's an arsenal here. There are multiple assault rifles. There's thousands of rounds of ammunition. Are we authorized to take it? And the way we had to handle it, and up until this law going into effect, the only thing that we could do is basically take that stuff for safekeeping. However, unless the person was involuntarily admitted for treatment or was found mentally incompetent to stand trial, or subsequently was charged with a crime and found not guilty by reason of insanity, as soon as they were released, they automatically had an absolute right to get those firearms back immediately. And it might still even be in a crisis at that point. So it's a legitimate issue. But I do want to second what Rip said, and I think it's really important for everyone here to understand the vast majority of people who suffer from mental illness or who are undergoing mental issues would never resort to violence. But we've got to be alert to those few, that very, very small group that could potentially do it. And of course, it's a compassionate bill, and that what we're trying to do is to stop people from harming themselves or from harming other people. And I really think that's the gist of the bill, and I think that's why it's so important. So there's a legitimate issue. I've constantly been very concerned about the intersection of mental health and firearms. That's obviously a very worrisome area. And I think that this new avenue for addressing some of these issues is really hopefully going to be somewhat of a game changer. One of the big things about it, though, if you look at the bill, the Commonwealth's attorney, law enforcement officers are we're the ones that are going to kind of be representing the government or the state's interest in these proceedings. But an awful lot of the information of the cases that arise, that's going to come from people very close to the person who is suffering the mental health crisis, okay? And that's really important. And one of the things I think we have to do a better job of as a society is lessening the stigma attached to mental illness. Obviously, I think everyone here would agree. If someone were suffering from cancer, we would not give that a negative connotation or think that there was something quote unquote wrong with them, that we wouldn't want to discuss that in polite conversation. Unfortunately, we've done better over the years, but I think that's still an issue. And one of the reasons why I think that's really important is if a stigma is attached, then that first line of warning is going to usually be family members or close friends. If they feel that they're somehow, saying that their friend or loved one is defective or is, somebody that should be kind of disregarded by society, they're going to be less likely to bring that information forward to law enforcement or to my office so that we can implement the proceedings that are necessary under the bill. So I think that's really important. I think education is really important. I think we need to stress that those of us in authority completely understand that most people who encounter a mental health crisis are not going to hurt anybody, and that we want to be thoughtful and compassionate and selective about using this new avenue. And also, as Rip pointed out, I mean, there are legitimate constitutional issues around the possession of firearms. So that's kind of the background for it. I am interested. It's going to be interesting to see what happens come July 1st, how frequently we are asked to bring proceedings. I have no way of knowing. I really have no way of knowing if this is going to be something that we're frequently asked to do, if it's going to be just a handful of times a year. But I suspect, just given the number of calls I've had in past years, that we're going to, in Alexandria at least, probably see a half dozen, maybe 10 times a year where we're actually able to use this bill to try to intervene in a situation before it gets out of hand. And I've read the bill through. I can't say that I'm an expert in the details of it, but we in my office will be representing the Commonwealth, if you will. So we'll be the ones kind of bringing forward the petition. We'll be appearing in court, and we'll be arguing on behalf of the position that that we need to have the order entered. So we're going to have an active and very important role in implementing the bill once it goes into effect next week. So maybe if we have a meeting like this in 6 to 8 months, I can report back. Obviously, I couldn't talk about individual cases, but I could tell you how frequently we're encountering it, how often we're seeking to have an order entered, and how often it's actually being entered. Maybe I'll have a little bit more data for you once we have a couple of months under our belt, but I'm looking forward to it. I actually remember talking to Rob Krupiga when he was our delegate 7 or 8 years ago about trying to do something like this because I thought it was an issue then. And it's a really important step forward. And we're really lucky to have people in the assembly like Delegate Sullivan who are willing to just persevere and make sure that we can get bills like this passed. So those are my thoughts. And obviously, like everybody else on the panel, I'm happy to answer some questions in a few minutes.
All right, thank you very much, Brian. And maybe in that period, we'll maybe find out if the Attorney General has communicated with you about this in any way. Now we'd like to move to Alexandria's Police Chief, Michael Brown, if he is on the system. Michael, are you there?
Yeah, Paul, can you hear me now?
Yes, good, excellent.
I apologize for the difficulty with Zoom this evening, but I'm here, folks. And let me echo, first of all, Rip, thank you very much for this. Our folks often encounter mental health cases. They're often masked and other types of calls. everything from domestic violence to people who are presenting behavioral issues. And like Brian, occasionally, as a matter of protocol, we actually all the time ask if there's weapons in the house. And occasionally we find the type of behavior, type of weaponry, if you will, at the same time, at the same location. But like Brian, I'm not sure exactly how many times we're going to be using this, but it's a tool that we need to be able to separate the individual from the weapon, at least during this period of time until it can be stabilized. In the law enforcement community, when this bill was going through, and I'm sure you probably heard it, Rip, a lot of folks were concerned about their evidence rooms being besieged with weapons. I took a little bit of a different tack even with my colleagues. I really don't care. We'll find room somehow. But the real issue is we want to make sure that people are safe. And the interesting thing about this is that when we started looking at our mental health calls for service and mental health related calls, we were looking over the last 2 years, and quite frankly, they are going up. They don't necessarily come out as a 911 call saying someone's acting strange. That usually is something else. And as a result of that, we have individuals who are going through some period of crisis. And when we get into those long-term things, especially if it's a diagnosis, we need this tool to do that. We are going to be working with the Commonwealth Attorney on each individual case. Our folks are being trained next week before the 1st on this particular issue, so they are aware that the thing is available. And again, like Brian, I'm not sure exactly how many we're going to have, but it's good to have this tool because we will have them. And so I'll be happy to take any questions later on. So thank you very much, Paul, for having me on board.
Well, that's a wonderful start. We really appreciate that. It's great that you made it through and found your way to our video screen. So that's exceptionally good. We also have with us tonight an expert on protection orders, Rebecca Wade. She's an attorney with Wade Grimes here in Alexandria. And she has some great insights about the practical realities of protection orders. I'd like her to step up and share with us her thoughts on the orders that she's been using as an attorney and how she feels this order will work. Rebecca?
Hi, good evening, Paul. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So, I met Paul a while back and we started talking about protective orders because that is something that I do a lot of. I probably try anywhere between 1 and 3 protective orders a month. So I'm in the double digits definitely each year. And, I was telling Paul when we first met that, just in the last couple of years, I've had 2 protective order cases that have resulted in fatalities due to gun violence. One was a gentleman who took his own life after there was a protective order that was issued. And I recall in that case telling the client, in my opinion, if you don't get the protective order, he's liable to kill the both of you. And I believe that the protective order probably stopped that from happening, but unfortunately, it was unable to save the man. Another case where it did result in a protective order case that ultimately concluded with a murder-suicide. The gentleman killed his wife that had the restraining order against him, and then himself on the wife's parents' front lawn while their 6-year-old son stood in the doorway watching. So, I don't really take a political side on this. I'm not a politician. I'm a lawyer. We talk about what needs to happen. When I look at this, I look at it and say, okay, well, as a lawyer, how can I use this tool to help my clients? And what do I see as the differences between protective orders and these substantial risk protective orders? And so looking at it, there are a lot of differences. Right now in Virginia, you get a protective order there are two kinds of protective orders for family abuse, which are seen with much higher frequency, and then protective orders between non-family members. But the what you have to prove is the same. You have to prove that there's been an act of violence, force, or threat that causes the petitioner to be in reasonable fear of, physical harm. So it is not uncommon. It's, in fact, I just came from the Alexandria JDR court where I got a protective order for a client about 3 hours ago before I hopped on this call. And I had that conversation with that client and the people who were there supporting her outside the courthouse. And it's asked all the time, so are the cops going to go get his guns now? I just got a protective order. When are the cops going to go get their guns? And I have to explain to my clients that that's not going to happen. The police are not going to go get his guns. And right now, currently the law is, you're not even prohibited from possessing a firearm if you have a protective order under Virginia law. Virginia law says it's illegal to purchase and transport a firearm, which is interesting to me because in these protective orders that are issued, a lot of times there's a box that's checked, weapon involved, right? But there's no seizing of the weapon. So, I guess my first, I feel like I have a lot of questions, being an Alexandria lawyer for Brian and for Mike Brown here on what's going to happen now, right? Because I think when I read these two code sections, really, you have 19.2-152.13 and .14 that set out how you go about obtaining these protective orders. It's not explicit that getting a protective order for family abuse or for something else is going to be sufficient to make a finding of substantial risk. And the elements are a lot different. So one of the things that I have noticed is, first of all, we're in a totally different court. So if you want a protective order against, say, a spouse who's being abusive, you can go to the magistrate, but the magistrate only gives you a 3-day protective order. To get that 2-week protective order, you have to go to district court. Here, it's giving law enforcement a really wide range of options. You can get an emergency substantial risk protective order from a magistrate, from a district court judge, or from a circuit court judge. And please, Delegate Sullivan, if I am saying any of this is wrong, please jump in and correct me, but that's the way I read it. So, what I assume is going to happen is that, law enforcement is going to go to a magistrate, because it's a lot easier to get in front of a magistrate than it is to get in front of a judge, right? Get the 14-day, and then we're in circuit court. So what I think about as an attorney is, well, if I'm going to be handling one of these cases, and they have to find that there's a substantial risk to the respondent or to somebody else, you're really opening the door to anybody who's going to defend one of these cases to bring in mental health expert testimony. And you have to have this hearing within 14 days in a circuit court. I think it's not unusual to think that a hearing like this could take several hours, if not a full day of the court's time. So, I'm looking at this and I'm wondering, how's the court going to work this into its docket? And then in terms of just getting everything together to present that case within 14 days is a lot. I notice a difference between one of these orders as opposed to, say, what I'll call a regular protective order, is that there is no language in the statute that allows for a continuance, right? So if you have a spouse who's wants to get a protective order because there was an act of domestic violence, she goes to the Juvenile Domestic Relations Court. They get a preliminary protective order. It's actually 15 days. And then they come back, and then it says the first hearing's ex parte, just like this. But then you come back to your contested hearing where the respondent can object to the issuance of a protective order. And the way I do it, I represent people on both sides, but probably more so petitioners overall, is I tell my clients, look, if we have, as a petitioner, we have to be ready to go to trial. I mean, I had a trial today. I have a protective order trial in Arlington on Monday. And because the statute for a regular protective order says that it shall be heard within 15 days. But the respondent can move to continue it. So the way I approach protective orders right now, if I'm representing the petitioner, is I say, we're ready to go to court because we have no right to continue this case. Only the respondent does. In this statute, it says it shall be heard within 14 days. And there is no language in there that allows for a continuance. So, you know, if somebody were to come to my office and say, now here, obviously, it's going to be the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office that's going to represent the petitioner, because the petitioner in this is really the Commonwealth as opposed to an individual person. If somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm looking at this, I probably, if I were trying to defend it, would not be pleased that I had to be ready in 14 days. I might want my client to undergo an independent mental health evaluation. I might want to seek an expert witness. And there's really not language in that statute that allows that to happen. The other thing I noticed is, you know, it's just the fact that there's 180 days maximum, right? So if you get, what the statute says is if the court finds by clear and convincing evidence, which is actually a higher burden than if you, in a domestic violence protective order, the burden's preponderance. But in this, it's clear and convincing evidence. Now, in a domestic violence protective order, preponderance of the evidence, which is like 51%, right? And it's discretionary to the court. It says the court may issue a protective order. So you have all these cases that is really up to the discretion of the judge if they want to issue it or if they don't. Now, in this one, it's a higher burden. It's clear and convincing evidence, but the judge has to issue it. It says shall. So once the judge makes that finding, you know, all these other things that are sometimes argued in regular protective orders, like this is going to ruin his job, this is only a tactic, you know, to gain an upper hand in the divorce case, all these things that people argue, you really don't have that once you've made a finding of clear and convincing evidence. And so, but there's only 180-day maximum. In a regular protective order, you get 2 years. So now you get 180 days in this one, and that can be extended another 180 days if you show that the person continues to be a threat. So when I read this, my first thought is, so what happens if he's still a threat after a year? Can you go back and get a new substantial risk protective order and start all over? Can you go back to the magistrate? Because I assume these cases, realistically, what's going to happen is these cases are going to go through the magistrate. Magistrate's going to issue it. Commonwealth's attorney is going to get involved. You're going to have a 14-day hearing in circuit court. I just can't see reasonably that most people would even bother going through the district court. I see Mike Brown kind of like quietly nodding his head over there. So, I mean, that's realistically how it's going to come out. So I think there's a lot of, as a lawyer, I'm kind of excited about it because I think there's going to be a lot of arguments, probably in Court of Appeals. It wouldn't be Court of Appeals, it would be Supreme Court because it's civil and it's not domestic relations. So there'll be some Supreme Court litigation on whether you can go back and get one if the facts haven't substantially changed after a year. Now I feel like I'm rambling, but there was another thing, Paul, in your introduction that you wanted to talk about minority communities. And at this point, although I've been a private practice lawyer now for about 7 years, I spent the first half of my career as a public defender. And so I also tend to read these statutes and think about that. And one of the things that I noticed right away is that the concurrent with this substantial risk protective order, what you have is you also have the magistrate or the court issuing a warrant to physically go and get the guns, right? So what happens is law enforcement is going to get this order. They're going to go to this person's house. And what the statute says is there's the option to voluntarily relinquish them. But if in the opinion of the officer, if there's a reasonable belief that the person is not being honest about the firearms that they have in the house, then that allows them to go onto the premises and search. And I suspect that there's going to be great concern about the police using these orders to get into people's house and to search people's homes for other crimes that are not related, that are not the basis for this order. So, for example, if there's suspicion that a person is dealing drugs out of the house, but you don't have something that rises to the level of a search warrant for drugs, and then in that same time, there's, maybe there's an act of domestic violence, or there's some kind of skirmish or assault charge that comes up, that potentially a crafty police officer could go to a magistrate and say, there's a substantial risk here. There was an act of domestic violence. Here's all of the, data that shows that those cases, can result in high levels of lethality. We need to go get those guns. And then once they're in the house, when you get into search and seizure law, you can search any compartment that could contain a firearm. So now you're in people's drawers. Now you're in, people's desks. Now you're, if you want to, some cops are going to get into the crawl space, right? So, I don't know the answer. I think a lot of that is going to rely on people like Chief Brown to create good relationships between those communities and between law enforcement. That's what I see. I see there being a initial kind of reaction to, oh, they're looking for other reasons to get in their house. They're looking for other reasons to mess with us. And I'm really kind of curious, just as a lawyer, how this is going to be implemented, and the steps that the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office and the police are going to take to make sure that this is implemented in a positive way for the community, and in a way that the community feels, that it is an issue for their safety, and not just some other way to give the police more power. But I'm also happy to answer any questions.
Okay, well, Rebecca, that was incredibly thorough and very insightful, and I thank you for that. Before we get to the question and answer period, we're going to move to Mike Jason. Mike is an Army colonel retired, as I mentioned, and he's a consultant with the Pentagon, and he's had some very powerful firsthand experiences with regard to guns in the military that he wants to share with us. And he's also on our advisory committee, so we're greatly appreciative of that. Mike, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's really great to be here and be part of this conversation. So like Paul said, I retired last year, and ever since I retired, I wanted to give back to my own community. And as we dig into Alexandria, where we live, and be part of solutions. And I'm part of a growing group of veterans that's very alarmed by what's happening with guns, the intersection with our veteran suicides, and just in general, what's happening on our own streets, having been in Iraq and Afghanistan and all these amazing places, and then coming home. So there's challenges and opportunities when we deal with veterans and firearms and all that, but there's a lot of mythology. And I'm hoping tonight, maybe as part of this discussion, I can present some opportunities and challenges, again, as we craft public policy. I think, the incident that really grabs me is when, with these school shootings, and people on certain channels started talking about giving homeless veterans guns and putting them in schools. I mean, it's just absurd. And so why do we think that's absurd? Well, I spent 3 decades literally validating, training, certifying, storing, accounting for thousands of soldiers, every weapon system from the 9mm pistol to the M1 tank and every machine gun in between. So from storage to, again, training. So looking at all that, but that's not really what really set things in motion for me. It was sitting in the Pentagon and looking at the daily reports that the Army receives for incidents that happen with firearms across the world. And the Army, and when I say the Army, I mean the active Army, the Guard, the reserves, it's civilians, it's family members. So about a population of 2 million people. I got to watch the data every single day. And what was amazing to me is by a factor of probably 10 to 1, the incidents of malfeasance, accidents, domestic abuse, crimes, suicides are all done with privately owned firearms. So the alarms went off. It's not the training, it's the context within which the military uses weapons. It's how we store them, how we supervise. We don't go to the range with alcohol. We don't take the dog. We don't take kids. We don't have our guns lying around a coffee table. We do it right. And so there's a conversation to be had because our soldiers with all this training off duty on their own time with a couple beers are just as silly with their firearms. And I use silly, I want to use other terms, than some of our non-trained civilian counterparts. So that was my observation. And so taking the right lessons from the military, if we're going to take them at all, is hugely important in that education and supervision. And then, of course, there's the unique risk to the veteran population. And we heard it mentioned tonight, but I've got some stats. Gun suicides are nearly 70% of suicides for our veterans, 70%. 53,000 military veterans from between 2005 and 2017. That's 13 times the total number killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. That's an alarming number. And if we go down to other numbers, the firearm, which the veterans have a high propensity of owning, is 90+% successful. So more ownership, more of them, and then a 90+% effective rate, right? So other suicide methods for veterans are less than 10% effective. So that cry for help we all learned about with dealing with suicide isn't a cry anymore when it's 90% effective with weapons. So it really affects our community very deeply. 11 deaths a day, I think, is what we're tracking by firearm in the veterans community nationwide. And the White House just did a task force study on veteran suicide, and the method, firearms, wasn't mentioned at all. So it is really alarming. So there are 3 major points that I think that really we care about, and I think is important. And that's what this conversation is tonight. One is the temporary firearm removal. So orders like this that we're talking tonight. And what we have seen is family members are absolutely key. I've seen some messaging that I love, and I think that's part of the discussion tonight. What's going to work? How are we going to educate our communities? I've seen a message that really seems to hit home, and this is the one thing you can do, and that seems to go. And then secure storage is the other aspect. You know, where are these weapons? Because it's all about suicide and not only accidents, but it's the proximity to the crisis. If we can intervene, you know, that moment of risk, of tension, of getting, you know, a breakup, and then the gun is right there loaded, ready to go, and it's an instant impulse. That's that impulse control of young males that we have learned in the military. If we can break that time chain, we have been successful. And I would encourage, as we look at public policy, how do we make it easy to do the right thing? So what's the number that they call? Do we have the storage facilities with Chief Brown? What do first responders do? I mean, are they capable? Should they not? Should they be able to call somebody? How quickly can a family member get that weapon out of the way? And how easy do we make it do the right thing? And then we get to the public awareness. And the data we've seen is, rather than prevention, intervention seems to really work and resonate. Again, intervention, the one thing you can do. And so back to the military, just to close, the right lessons, we do this. Our suicide rates are alarming for veterans and are alarming potentially off duty, but they're not happening in places like Iraq and Afghanistan when our soldiers are downrange operating, because the context is different. And if there's a high risk, I as a commander, I just look at that soldier and I go, give me your firearm. It's that simple. Now, we can't do that in the real world, but I can tell you that it works, and we don't demonize the soldier or the individual. but we do remove the weapon, and it has been successful. So in closing, I would just offer veterans are heavily impacted by these risks and by suicide and by even domestic issues. So these laws are extremely helpful to our community and can work. So that's on that side. On the other side, I would offer that veterans are an opportunity to be allies and surrogates in the public awareness campaign. We believe in this. We know our firearms, we know our people, and we know the risks, and we know how to break the chain. And so I would just, again, offer for context, this law is extremely important, and we want to be part of the conversation, and we want to be allies.
Thank you very much. That's powerful. I just want to add that 60% is the estimate of suicide of all the gun deaths in America every year. It's 60%. And we reached 40,000 a few years ago, which is exceeded the number of car deaths in America, which is frightening. We don't know what's going to happen as a result of the change in our world this year with coronavirus. One hopes that these death rate will be down, but we'll eventually return to where we were, and unfortunately, we may return in every way. And so we have to use this time as effectively as we can. I want to take this moment then to just ask all of our speakers who've been so excellent tonight so far, if they would like to pose a direct question to one another. I think Rebecca has a couple that she's posed, and I think it'd be great to hear that first, and then we can shift over to Laura and let some of the questions be raised from the audience. So
I think Delegate Sullivan wanted to correct me on something I said.
No, this is not a correction situation. This is an explanation situation. First of all, let me just say, Mike, I'm glad the bill passed without you, but I wish we'd had you in Richmond to testify. Probably would have gotten a few more votes. That was terrific. And as I tried to suggest in my opening remarks, as I have always pitched this bill as much, if not more, a suicide prevention bill as a mass shooter bill, and the problems in our veterans community, particularly, Virginia's got more veterans than any state in the country. It's an absolute crisis. I really appreciated your remarks. Rebecca, I did want to try to either answer or respond to a couple of the things you asked. And the big picture is, or my sort of big picture answer is, like any piece of legislation, this bill had some compromises in it along the way. And one of the, we are going to have to sort of see how it works. Let me just tick off a couple of different things you mentioned. One of the things that's different about this bill, this now statute, and the protective order stuff you're talking about is law enforcement has to be involved. I can tell you, we received some pressure, I think is a fair word, and in some states they do it this way. The family itself can run off to the magistrate or the court. And that's how it is done in some states. We decided to involve Brian and Chief Brown from the very beginning as a sort of sieve, if you will. Because one of the issues, frankly, for those who don't like this bill is this notion that, ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriend's going to use it against the boyfriend, or the neighbor who's mad at you because the dog keeps coming onto the yard is going to run off to a magistrate and take your gun from you. Brian and the chief, in my view, fortunately, maybe their view, unfortunately, are the initial sieve to decide, okay, how real is this? So that's why this starts with law enforcement. You can't end up in front of a magistrate or a circuit court unless law enforcement brings it forward, basically agrees with you. The whole magistrate issue became a bit of a flashpoint. And part of that has to do with, remember, we're passing a bill for the entire state. I mean, you and I can get in front of a circuit court judge really quickly if we want, because there are lots of circuit court judges and they're always here. There are parts in the state where the circuit court judges still ride the circuit, and they may be literally hours away. And so that's at least one of the reasons why we left it. There had been some pressure to take magistrates out. We left it to include magistrates. With respect, I think there is a continuance provision in there for the respondent that allows him or her to go to the judge and say, I need more time. The 180 days, sort of same thing. Remember, we've got this by some is seen as a huge infringement on people's Second Amendment rights. And we got some pressure to make it a year long. And we decided that what we would do is make sure that it only lasted 180 days with an option to go further. And there is a right to appeal, by the way, from the subject of the order to get into circuit court before that 180 days is up. Clear and convincing sort of is the same thing. Frankly, we borrowed that from a bunch of other states. Again, while we want this to be used and we want it to be effective, we did opt to enhance the proof requirement to sort of make sure it's only used when it ought to be. And by the way, as we all know, and the bill references apropos of the sort of concern that people might use it as a weapon against a neighbor or a brother-in-law that they don't like. It is, of course, a crime to falsely swear out one of these complaints. I had another note to myself, but I'll wait because I don't want to take up other people's time. But the bill, in some ways, it's the proverbial sausage, right? It may not be the way Brian would have wanted to write it, or Chief Brown might have wanted to write it, or Mike, or Andy Goddard, but it's darn close. And I have this saying, this is why God invented next session. If Brian comes to us and say, geez, there are too many of them, or not enough of them, maybe we have to recalibrate this. But we think this is a great start. It's a lot like it's been done in other states, and we're really hopeful that it's. I'm not claiming it's perfect, but we're really hopeful it's going to save some lives.
Rebecca, would you like to address that?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I actually sent a little message. I was like, "Oh, can I talk again?" I just got a text. So in terms of the no continuance, that is correct. I was looking at a version of the bill as, I guess, submitted and not the one that was ultimately passed. So I think it's really great that that's in there. I think it's necessary. So that's a good thing. In terms of, my comments were not to say, oh, let me point out all the bad stuff about it. Certainly, it was just more, I think you're right. Nothing's going to be you have to compromise, and nothing's going to be 100% perfect. And, but I was just saying, from my perspective as a lawyer, these are the things that, jump out as me. And I definitely, that was on my list of things actually to talk about that I skipped over. But yeah, the big difference is that law enforcement has to do an investigation. But, I think it's interesting, just to bring up, I guess, Paul's point at the beginning of this is we're in a time right now where law enforcement is probably less trusted than it's been in a lot of years. So when you are, presenting this, I think it's good that, a neighbor, for example, right, can't just go out and get it. But, if from like Paul's perspective, if we're trying to say we want to publicize this, we want to let people know that this is an option, we want to let people know that it's out there and that it's good, I think that law enforcement right now has a lot of work to do, and I hope that they can get, people's faith back.
Other thoughts from our speakers on what we've discussed so far? Michael, please unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, Thank you, Paul. And Rebecca, I couldn't agree with more, not so much about the perception issue, but certainly the idea of communicating it, because we don't want to get in a situation. First of all, we have to communicate that it's available and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that can be done not just by law enforcement, by also some of the other departments in the city and the community groups. We've talked about reaching out to a number of them so they can advise their clients. For example, those that are with getting domestic violence support from DCHS, for example, or maybe some of the victims groups and stuff and victims assistance programs so they know what's available. One thing that I do like about the fact we have law enforcement involved is that our folks can make an assessment as to the threat so that when the order is actually heard before the magistrate or the court, they at least have some factual basis to suggest that there is perhaps a problem and there is a need to issue the other order to go look at the weapons. We don't look at these as a situation where we are going to go rummaging through the house in many cases. What we find, in at least the one that I'm discussing with a lot of my officers, is the other person that's in the house is very keen on trying to give us the weapons in many cases, or point out the fact that they have a weapon in the bedroom or whatever. Now, we're not going to let them bring it out to us. We'll obviously go in there for an officer safety piece, but I think we can build in a certain amount of discretion during this period of time, collect some more information, and as Rip pointed out later, there's a need to adjust it. Let's do it. The outcome here, for the most part, is trying to make that place and the people involved safe. And I think we've kind of communicated that to our officers in discussing this bill as it moved through. The other thing I would offer is, as far as collecting weapons, we periodically do get people who come in and surrender their weapons because of one manner or another, an issue that comes to not too often, but it does happen. And we will take temporary custody of them during a period of time. So even some cases, we have individuals who recognize the potential threat. Now, again, we don't know what that workload is going to be, but at the same time, let's try it and see what happens, because if we can save one life, it's worth it.
Could you go into some depth about your training for your officers? I think it'd be helpful.
Well, our officers get training in how to respond to domestic violence issues. They also get training in search and seizure. Locally, they get training in how to approach a magistrate, fill out the affidavit, all that. In terms of establishing some kind of a case, this has a certain set of rules that we're going to have to try and come up with and conform to in presenting the facts before whatever the court or the magistrate. You just can't pull it out of the air. You have to have something that you can potentially testify to, or at least, acknowledge in the actual affidavit before the court. So all that's done in a variety of training. What we're trying to do is update what we're going to be doing going forward as should these cases come. And I think the officers will be okay. It'll be a struggle for a couple times. We'll learn some things we're going to have to adjust at the very beginning. But I'm pretty convinced that I don't believe this is going to be abused. If it looks that way, then we'll change our policy accordingly. But the real key here, and I think most of the officers are very, very frustrated by the fact that they know they have a weapon in a situation that doesn't appear to have they leave the scene, and it's not necessarily a safe scene when they leave it, because they are always worried about what might be in that house or in that business or whatever else. So I think in some cases this will be worthwhile to at least collect data, learn as we go. And as Rip pointed out later on, if there's a problem, we'll be one of the first to work with Rip and with Brian and his office and the bar, for that matter, to try and make sure we do this right.
One more question real quick. There's been a lot of talk in the news about the term de-escalation. And I'm wondering, in context of this order, how do you view that phrase, that word, in the way your officers will interact with people?
We spend a lot of time on de-escalation. About 2.5 years ago, we set a goal to have all of our patrol officers and a number of the detectives already have the training. It's crisis intervention training. We're at 60% right now. And the only thing that's holding us back is availability of, right now, COVID-19, but of course, availability of training programs. In fact, I was one of the first ones to go through after we made that. And the training and the officers do an incredible job on a day-to-day basis on trying to do de-escalation. I've seen them. I've been on some of the calls with them. I read it in the reports. They're very, very patient in this department. And I can't say that's the case in every department because as we found out through the last 3 weeks, not every department is as aggressive in terms of trying to do de-escalation as we're trying to do. So that training is a 40-hour class. It's done by the Department of Community and Human Services by certified trainers. It goes to a national standard, and then it includes practical exercises so that the first responders that are in there in the forward-facing parts of our city government can actually understand how to recognize behavioral issues, and also to try and get people to a point where they can be worked with in a particular situation. I was very impressed with the training myself. And you get a shirt and a pin when you get through.
Excellent. Well, we hope that is a successful project that shirt and pin encourage people. Are there other speakers who'd like to interject at this point about anything else that we brought up? Yes, Rebecca.
Sorry, I was gonna say, one of the things that I think, some of my thoughts come from the fact that, we're in Alexandria where we have, the Alexandria Police Department and the Alexandria Commonwealth Attorney's Office, but this is a statewide bill, right? And, I started my career in a rural jurisdiction where not only could you maybe not get to a circuit court judge, like Delegate Sullivan was saying, but you might be in a place where law enforcement's, 20 or 40 minutes away from you if you call 911. And so, I just think it's going to be interesting to see how these cases are dealt with in different parts of the state. And some of the things that I brought up are not things that I really think are going to be issues here in Alexandria, but they might be issues in places like Culpeper, Rappahannock, Abingdon and those places. So it's going to be interesting. And ultimately, when, well, the one other thing I'll say is, judges are the ones that are going to have to be issuing these orders, right? Once you get into circuit court. And we have a wide variety of judges throughout the state too. In Virginia, judges are not popularly elected like they are in some states. They're appointed by the politicians. And so it's incumbent upon the politicians to put the right people on the bench to get the right results. You can pass great laws, but if you don't have great judges, they're not going to be as effective in my mind.
I want to just raise quickly before we turn to Laura in the audience, data collection. I'd like Brian and Michael both to express whether the Attorney General or this or any ideas that they have on how we would track the people who are calling and requesting this help and what happens to each one of those people after they've made that request. Are either one of you responsible for tracking that and providing it to the public in any way? Brian, Michael?
Well, I don't know what the Attorney General's role would be. The Attorney General, you asked earlier, Paul, if they've given us any guidance. The answer to that question is no, but that's not really his role. In Virginia, the Attorney General is a separate office. It's not like the Commonwealth's attorneys work for him. Instead, we have a statewide agency called the Commonwealth's Attorney Services Council, which has put together a webinar to train prosecutors about this new law going into effect. And I guess because of COVID, we haven't had that training yet. That's going to happen in approximately a week. As far as the numbers go, I'm not aware of any statewide requirement to maintain and release this information. However, I'm personally invested and interested in how frequently we use it in Alexandria, and so I would think between the chief and me, we can make a pledge that we will track that data, transparently produce it, and make it clear to everybody at the 1-year mark, and make it clear to the citizenry how many times we've used it over the intervening year, and I mean, obviously we couldn't go into individual cases, but we could give raw data about how many times we sought the orders and how many times they were actually granted. So I'm willing to make that pledge.
Can I jump in real quick? I mean, so sorry.
Introduce yourself.
We also just got our new forms from the Supreme Court, and that has been in accordance with, you know, trying to follow the law. And that is going to be another way that we'll be able to keep the data, because Andrew, I think, is still on this call. And speaking with Lori, I know that is definitely something that, you know, Professor Bonnie at UVA and a lot of the think tank people who are behind this movement most definitely want to keep this data. So to the extent that we're going to have a new form from the Supreme Court, that'll be helpful in at least seeing how the issuances are going. But internally, I think Brian's correct. And to the extent that Chief Brown was talking about their calls for service, there's a code there that they will be able to track as well.
You are Shannon Taylor, Commonwealth's attorney from Henrico County. Thank you for interjecting. Go on, Chief Brown.
Yeah, let me just echo what Brian said and what Shannon said. We currently, at least in our department, about 2 years ago, changed some of our data collection protocols so we could flag things involving mental health. So we know we have at least an N or a sample size that gives us a flavor of what the calls for service or the interaction between our officers and the public involving this particular issue. We also have the ability to track and cross-reference that for any kind of order, and we're looking at recoding an order for this particular case so we can capture it. The outcome is going to obviously be working through Brian and the courts and everything else, but I'm willing to pledge with Brian that we'll collect information on this so we can get an idea. We need to know that as well as to what it would do for our workload, especially in conjunction with some of the interest the City Council has made in terms of trying to shift some of that mental health workload from the police department to some of the other social services where people can get help. So this could be very informative for all of us, and so we'll collect that information that we can.
Excellent. At this point, we want to make sure we get other people from the audience an opportunity to ask you questions. So I'm going to turn the show over to Laura Mandela, our Vice President of Safer Country, to let her present these questions. Laura, the ball is yours.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks so much to the speakers for this really informative discussion tonight. We are fortunate to have, you know, many influential people on the line tonight, but one of them is Eileen Zeller. She's with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America in Maryland, and she's part of the Red Flag Education Co-Lead. And she's been asking about the types of training that have been given to law enforcement. I think some of that was addressed. And then she wants to know how we're going to educate the public about the new law. A few of her questions. And Eileen, if you want to follow up, feel free to unmute yourself. But whoever would like to jump into that.
Well, as far as the, go ahead, Brian.
I mean, the publicizing it is a important point, I think. You know, the one way I can help with that a little bit is I'm frequently asked to write a column in the Alexandria Times. Now that's not going to get to as many eyes as we probably would want it. But every year in July, I usually do write a column about the new laws that have gone into effect. And I'm willing to make this the first law that I discuss in that column. And then of course I could put it on Facebook and tweet it. Maybe people that are interested in this could help by retweeting it or sending it out. So that's just one minor way of doing it, but I do agree that that's a very important thing. Perhaps the chief has an idea too.
Yeah, coupled with what Brian's suggesting, we have liaisons with 104 civic associations within the city. And we can put that on the agenda for their conversations, many of which are already doing Zoom meetings or team meetings because of the social distancing. But at the same time, we can also use, I think one of the untapped resources in this particular area is, again, the Department of Community and Human Services. Kate Garvey's got a whole lot of programs over there that deal with people who are affected by the type of behavior and the type of incidents we're talking here. I plan to talk, after talking to our folks, we plan to utilize them to get the word out as well. So there's a lot of different vehicles. We just need to be able to conform the message that we want to give to folks, and so they know how to access this and not abuse it at the same time, because we don't want that to be an issue, for the continuation of this particular new piece of legislation. And Brian, I'll commit to you to work with you on that messaging so we're consistent across the board.
So I love what you're saying, and I think every state that has an extreme risk protection law right now is struggling as to how best to implement it and how best to educate people. We were really lucky, and you all probably know this, that Sheriff Darren Popkin in Montgomery County, before our law went into effect in October of 2018, he held regional trainings for the various police departments and sheriff's department in Maryland. And he's well respected, and that really helped us. I don't know how Virginia is structured. You're a much larger state than us. Our rural and conservative areas are much smaller than yours. But you may want to talk to him about doing that. And I'd be happy to talk with, I don't know who's responsible for public education or implementation or anything like that, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody about what we've done. And we don't have the answer either. It's different in every state, but I applaud what you're trying to do anyway.
Paul?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Laura's handling this portion, but did you want to make a comment?
Yeah. Hi. Well, first of all, what a great gathering, and hats off to Safer Country. And special welcome, Dr. Really great to see you on the Zoom. Can you hear me?
Allison, this is Allison Silverberg, our former mayor of Alexandria. Allison, did you have a question directed to someone?
I wanted to add that really so many cities right now are looking at what they're doing and what they need to be doing, and ours included. But really, hats off. Our city for a long time has had de-escalation training, anti-bias training. But the de-escalation training that Chief Brown mentioned is so excellent. It's my understanding that we've won like a national award for it's called CIT. The chief mentioned it, Crisis Intervention Team. And it's really driven by the people with MSWs, the social workers, the people from the Department of Community and Human Services under Kate Garvey, and Liz Wixon, who works with an MSW, but is part of the police department, and is, I think Chief Brown can also sing her praises even better than I can, and I'm a huge fan of Liz Wixon. And so it's really from a compassionate point of view, and the idea of serving with your heart is something that I've heard Chief Brown mention a number of times, but reaching out to the Federation of Civic Associations, continuing to reach out through Kate Garvey and DCHS. And I love the idea that Eileen mentioned, which is the regional trainings. And that might be something that we can discuss, that Brian Porter and and others can really take to heart. And we did, as Chief Brown mentioned, we did add data transparency during my term as mayor. But as far as I'm concerned, I think, the idea that we could add even another niche to it regarding this. And really, this was a big concern of Governor McAuliffe as far as domestic violence and gun ownership. Paul, you know a lot about that as well. And so anything that we can do to continue to move forward for more public safety. But my hat's off to Rip Sullivan, Delegate Sullivan. Thank you for your service. It's a huge team effort, but really hats off to you and everyone who made this possible.
Thank you.
If I
Laura?
can just add
Oh, yeah.
one thing real quickly, it's that your rural areas are going to be where your higher rates of gun ownership are. So it's really important to, you know, see what you can do in those areas.
We might just take, I might just take a moment of privilege to say, it would be helpful to hear from perhaps Rip about any concerns he might have about enforcement by law enforcement in certain parts of the state that are not as comfortable as perhaps our part of the state is. Rip, do you have thoughts on that?
Thank you, Paul. I do. We all know that you know, before the session, during the session, after the session, there was this, you know, Second Amendment sanctuary movement. Frankly, my reaction is more curiosity, Paul. I will be really interested to see how this plays out around the state, including our more rural areas. And I'd be interested in Chief Brown's reaction to this. You know, I've never been in law enforcement, and you know, I don't own any weapons. I respect people who do, and have no problem with people who do. But I don't think I'd want to be the sheriff or the chief of police or the Commonwealth's attorney who sort of took some principled, I'm never going to implement this because we're a Second Amendment sanctuary city, and then have some veteran kill herself right after her family came forward and asked me to intervene. I like the word Chief Brown uses. This is a new tool. It's not going to be used in every situation that every member of law enforcement gets approached. I would like to think that it's going to be used around the state in the way it's meant to be used, which is carefully and in the right circumstances, and to save lives. And you know, people who are in law enforcement, whether they're chiefs of police or law enforcement sheriffs or Commonwealth's attorneys, take oaths to implement the law and to use the tools we give them to try to save lives. And so there was a lot of angst about sanctuary cities, a lot of talk about this bill, and people saying, oh, we'll never use it. I hope that's wrong. I hope that's not how it plays out, because this bill, someone said it, either Mike or Chief Brown, or maybe, you know, saves one life. I'll be thrilled with the time and effort that we put in.
If I could jump in on that a little bit, it probably will vary across the state. The implications for law enforcement are in many cases governed by what the local interest would be and the local community standards are, as far as enforcement and things of that nature. I know that there are certain chief executives of law enforcement agencies that had concerns with this bill. But I also know that cops like to copy good programs. And if we can be successful in this and not intrusive and not raise the red flag, if you will, of, you know, the Second Amendment concerns, and actually save a life or two in the process, you might find law enforcement changing its mind in terms of the application of it. And that's just from my perspective, and I can't speak for the Commonwealth attorneys. I'll defer to my colleague from that office.
Laura, are you there?
I am.
Any other questions from the audience you'd like to bring forward?
So Dusty Horwitz is asking, if police departments had to be accredited every 5 years, do we think this would improve transparency in policies and training?
Actually, I think that came from Ken Cummins, but that's all right.
Sorry, Ken Cummins. Ken Cummins. Yeah.
Ken's on our advisory committee too, and works in the investigation fields. Go ahead, Mike.
I can't speak to the impact of this accreditation on this. We've been accredited for about 26 years. In fact, we just passed our major accreditation review just this year. And some standards. The state standards are akin to what we use, which is the CALIA standards, which is a national standard. It's a little more extensive than the state standard. Many agencies go for accreditation. Those that can't afford CALIA will go and do usually the state standard inspection program. There is nothing in any of the standards right now that speak to this specifically, but they do talk about de-escalation. They do talk about your response to domestic violence. You're looking at your policies, protocols, trainings, and the like. So to that extent, I think you find that people who are in an accreditation process have a little more exposure to the elements of what you're looking at in a situation where this law would be applied. But I don't know if you can make that direct correlation that accreditation would lead to enforcement of this. But it certainly helps the profession.
And now the question from Dusty Horwitz. It's a question for Delegate Sullivan. How involved was Senator Deeds in this legislation in light of the situation with his son several years ago?
I'm sorry, the question was how loud was he?
How involved was he?
Well, he was loud and involved. Cree speaks with great credibility and passion on issues like these. This was George Barker's bill, so Cree was not didn't lead the charge, but was enormously helpful, and of course, most importantly, spoke with his vote. So, Cree has spent the last, what is it 10 years now, 8 years, trying to take his personal tragedy and use that to help others. I will say one of the, it's not a disappointment, but this bill isn't, as I said, isn't perfect, and it doesn't solve, certainly not going to solve every problem out there. One of the questions we often got asked, if not by opponents, even by some supporters who were concerned that it didn't go far enough. So you're going to take this gun from this person, whom friends and family are concerned is unstable in some way or in a crisis in some way, and leave him or her behind, with a house full of knives or other ways to hurt themselves or others. How's this going to help them? And some of this gets to Mike's point about the lethality of guns when it comes to suicide attempts. It also points to some of the issues that are in current day America, first and foremost, which is how we have to do a better job of getting people matched up with mental health services and crisis intervention services, and whether the police are the right people all the time to do that. So that's sort of maybe that's the next step, is we need to do a better job. I will tell you that I think this is both anecdotal, and I think some of the research shows this as well, that when one of these orders is implemented, most typically, of course, at the request of family or dear friends who are worried about a loved one, that does present an opening, if you will, an opportunity for family to intervene, if you will, and to finally help their loved one find some help. I don't have any doubt we as a society could do a better job of supporting people who are trying to help their families find this kind of help. But I think the experience is that these orders provide an opportunity, an opening, if you will, for that to happen in cases where it might not otherwise happen.
I want to take this moment, if I may, to interject that I've been alerted that unfortunately votes are running long tonight at the House up on Capitol Hill. And unfortunately, that means Representative Don Beyer will not be joining us, as we're getting close to the end of our 2 hours. We're about 20 minutes away. I was hoping he might still make it, but I'm afraid we'll have to reserve him for another day. We will bring him back to talk about what he's doing on a national level. So let me then turn back to Laura for any other questions that we have, Laura?
Yeah, from Kelly Roscom. Chief Brown, the bill requires law enforcement to conduct an independent investigation before a petition for an SRO may be filed. What does an independent investigation look like?
Good question.
Well, for us, an investigation is to look at what can be factually determined at a particular scene or with a complaint. We do that as a matter of routine. I think what they're referring to as an independent investigation, as opposed to a family member or someone in a domestic situation coming forward and presenting the case. There may be an element of bias because of that relationship or whatever. We come in and doing an independent investigation. We're trying to determine what is factually present in that particular instance. And from that, if we can make that standard in terms that's in the bill for as far as the safety or the potential hazard that's there, then we can go forward and with the magistrate and move as we see it and seek the order. But it's not like I just don't like Mike, so I'm going to go take his guns and I go to the magistrate and get the thing without someone, at least an independent person, in this case the police department, examining what's actually taking place and seeing whether it meets that standard that's in the statute.
And let me just say, as the guy who actually put those words in the statute, the chief's got it exactly right. It was all a part of that effort to have law enforcement be the gatekeeper and fend off, frankly, criticisms that this could become a weapon used by disaffected friends or neighbors. And what an independent investigation looks like is going to, my guess, be as varied as the fact situations that present themselves. So an independent investigation in this case is going to look different than the independent investigation in that case. But the intent, I can tell you from those of us who were writing this, was exactly as the chief says, to make sure that some inquiry, some thought from someone who's not to give some confidence that the process has got a second, third, or fourth set of eyes on it before it moves forward.
If I may, Rebecca introduced the idea that the police might take advantage of the order to seek other evidence unrelated to this matter. Is that a concern of yours, Rip, or yours, Chief Brown?
I mean, I can tell you, Rebecca, you're not the first person to say that. During the debate on this bill, this is going to be used by law enforcement. I think the bill's obviously not intended for that purpose. If we see abuses of it, that's why God invented next session.
If I could also add, some of that obviously can be addressed in policy and approach and how we're trying to give guidance to our officers. The difficulty runs into, and Rebecca's absolutely right, if we walk in or we're invited in to get a weapon and heaven forbid there's a homicide victim in the room, we can't ignore that homicide victim, obviously. But, in many cases, what the officers find is people come and deliver the weapons or point exactly where you're going to get the weapon. And if the scope of the order is to just retrieve the weapons and you know where you're going, you don't necessarily have to rummage through the whole house to find it. But there may be those instances where we have to go search to find the weapons based upon what's reported to us in our investigation. So some of that could be curtailed in policy, but we don't know enough to know exactly how often we're going to even encounter that. And I think this is what we need to kind of track to see we protect the rights of the individual and don't abuse our rights in search and seizure.
Yeah, is it okay if I say something? I think, what you have essentially is the issue of, we've heard so often in the last few weeks, the issue of the bad apple, right? obviously, we have this bill. It's intended to do something. It's intended to be used for one purpose. And I mean, to be clear, I wasn't saying that I was worried about law enforcement doing that, but that, I think that there's going to be that concern out there by groups of people, especially with what we have going on right now. So, it's, at the end of the day, I say, again, it's incumbent upon, people like Chief Brown, who have very difficult jobs, to make sure that there aren't those bad apples, and make sure that, there's enough outreach in the community that you have a good relationship. But I actually wanted to ask a question, if I could. So procedurally, right, I'm looking at this law and I'm thinking, I have a case right now that's a protective order. There's criminal charges pending in this case, where I represent a young woman in the protective order case, who also has a very serious, she's the victim in a very serious criminal case. And so, I would say, based on my facts and what I know, that this would be a good, this law might be applicable. So if I were, for example, to advise this young woman, that it might be in her best interest to ask law enforcement to do the investigation and see if a Tiger order is appropriate, which, by the way, in 2020 with Tiger King, I think it's like, great, I'm on the Tiger train here. But if I wanted to tell her that, where would she go? How would she ask that this investigation be conducted? Or is that even appropriate? I mean, is the victim of a crime the one to be asking for that? Or should we just go to somebody in Brian's office and say, hey, you're handling this case. What about this? Where do we go from here?
Well, from our perspective,
if I could just real quick, Mike, I mean, my office, we don't have investigators in my office, and we can't do the investigation because then my lawyers become witnesses, either in a criminal case or a civil case. So in any type of situation, whether it's a crime being alleged or a temporary detention order for mental health observation, or I would agree also in this particular circumstance, we're just, the way Virginia is set up, some states have prosecutors' offices that have their own investigators. That's just not the way Virginia normally does it. So we don't have any in my office, and so we have to have the police department be the investigative agency. So if someone were to call me, it's not that I would give them the runaround. I think what I would do is I would talk to them, probably make my own independent assessment as to whether or not I thought it was a situation where a police investigation might be warranted. And at that point, I would probably contact Mike directly and just say, hey, I had a citizen call me. This is what they told me. I went through it a little bit with them, and I think it would be worthwhile for you guys to investigate. And then I would expect and really have to let them kind of handle the investigation part of it.
And that's exactly it as it applies here. And frankly, we get calls that would probably be candidates for this all the time. We get everything from welfare checks to reports of domestic violence. We run to these mental health issues. We get people who are reported to us. It can come directly to us. Sometimes, many times, it goes directly through our communication systems or 911 or now 311. We've received a couple of them. But our response would be the same. We will go out, meet with the individual, and make the same kind of assessment and do an investigation if warranted. And if there was enough, then we'd obviously be working with Brian's folks to see what we need to do to move forward. If it was after hours and of some urgency, then there might be a different story. But we would be the intake on that for the city of Alexandria. That said, it might be different in different jurisdictions across the Commonwealth.
Great. Paul, can I just make two other comments here? Because we got some really good observations from Sarah Peck. One, she says that the domestic violence organizations and advocates would be great educators and able to raise awareness about the availability of this new tool. I really agree with that, knowing how effective, our state sexual and domestic violence action network is. We've got, really strong advocates here. So I'm sure they're aware of it and are going to use it and make sure that everyone is aware of its availability. And then she says that, well, she asks if Chief Brown has met with any Black leaders in Virginia to determine ways to address the concerns that they have. And she points to the Northeastern Law School ERPO report, which found that distrust of law enforcement in the Black community has led to low rates of utilization of these ERPO laws. And no surprise there. But she says it's going to be necessary to the success of the law.
Well, I haven't spoken. I've spoken in the last month to a lot of members from the African American community, local leaders, individuals, members of the clergy, and the like. We haven't spoken directly about this. We've actually been kind of focused on, obviously, other issues about police legitimacy, and more importantly, what the Alexandria Police Department's done in terms of transparency, especially after the killing of George Floyd. But also in advance of that. We would be marketing, or at least using that same kind of discussion for the potential and some of the other things that we do in terms of this marketing plan that I was talking about. Some of the homeowners associations is a good example, but we also have a clergy council, which includes members of the Black community. I've got a community advisory team in 21st Century Policing, which has representatives from the NAACP in there and other members of the community. We will be talking about that in our next meeting coming up in July, in a couple weeks. So those are the kinds of ways we can reach out. And then, of course, like anything else, myself and my staff will become available to go out and meet with people and discuss this. The issue with regards to the trust is just taken, the African American community has taken is top of the fold on the front page, obviously because of things that have taken place. I don't take that for granted, the relationship that we have. And so it's an awful lot of work now to make sure we keep that relationship and the investment we've made in the city of Alexandria. And we can certainly use this to explain that we're not trying to be intrusive, we're trying to be helpful. And that community is not immune from it, just like any other community in the city of Alexandria.
Laura, let me just say, thank Sarah. I didn't know about this Northeastern report. I've already clipped it and emailed it to myself. I'll be reading it first thing in the morning. Thanks for that, Sarah.
Okay, Paul, and that's all we have from the audience. If I've forgotten anything or you still want to jump in, feel free.
Laura, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask based upon your concerns about domestic violence issues or any other matter that in your mind?
Well, I mean, I have been very active in domestic violence here in Alexandria and elsewhere. And no, I think, I mean, I've been very satisfied with the direction this has taken. And I think the law has been a great compromise among a lot of different factions. And as I said, I think the statewide network of advocates and organizations addressing both sexual assault and domestic violence are going to be important in bringing some cases to light.
Let me just point out Mike Jason's generous offer earlier in this program. And I'm curious if Chief Brown, you want to talk to Mike about his offer of getting the military involved in any way in helping what you're doing.
Actually, we'll take help from anybody that wants to kind of spread the word. Mike, why don't you and I chat offline about that? And I'm sure we can get our information, our contact stuff through Paul. How's that?
Sounds great. Look forward to helping any way I can, Chief.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Paul, can I
yes?
I don't have any role in any of this, but I wanted to pay attention because I want to be an informed citizen.
Pat, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Pat Malloy. I'm on the Alexandria Democratic Committee. I'm the Central Committee of the party. But I was a former lawyer in the Justice Department. I was the General Counsel of the Senate Banking Committee. I was Assistant Secretary for Trade. So I've been around politics and policy for many years. But I want to salute Brian and Michael and others for the great relations they've been able to build here in Alexandria with our community to avoid these kinds of difficulties that other communities are facing. And I love the fact that you guys put on this seminar for people like me to learn more about what's going on in this important issue.
Thank you very much, Pat. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all of our fine speakers tonight who come forward and share this evening with us. We've learned a great deal. I've learned a great deal. I think everybody has. Really great insights into how our community works, how this law may or may not work, and how much we're going to have to follow it to ensure that it does work the way we all want it to work. So I look forward to coming back to this issue in the future. Yes, I'm sorry. I look forward to coming back to this issue in the future, and I'm really thrilled that Safer Country was able to do this, and I hope everyone will check us out again at www.safercountry.org. We're new, we're a startup, we do need support, we do need your help. It's still time to be a sponsor for this event, and we're hopefully going to be able to share this recording with other communities so that they can as well learn and gain insights from this. Each jurisdiction in Virginia is different, and one thing I've discovered in calling around in preparation for this event is that I spoke to a sheriff from Florida who described to me that every county in Florida seemed to be operating under a different premise for how they thought this law should operate. And it's very inconsistent in terms of how it's working. So it's critical that we track it here throughout the state and frankly throughout the country in various different states. Be critical for us to understand this thoroughly in order for us to make it as effective as possible, but that is the goal. And I think ultimately it has potential is enormous for saving lives, as we all agree. So at this point, let me just thank Laura for her role in this and for her work for Safer Country. Let me thank our board president, Boyd Walker, also our board treasurer, Vincent Smith. My wife, Lori, is on the board, is also a CPA and an accountant, and she's doing a great job for Safer Country. And we really are excited about being part of this process. I got involved with this because of my role first with the Virginia Tech victims. I was pleased to be their executive director and worked on these issues. And now I'm taking it a step further here with Safer Country. So thank you all for being here, and good night. Stay safe.